All right, welcome to another deep dive. You know, we always love it when you guys send us stuff to dig into, and you've given us some really interesting material this time,
Yeah.
focusing on CBME competency-based medical education and how the accreditation systems that we use, the ones that evaluate and sort of approve medical training programs, how they can either really help CBME succeed or kind of put up some roadblocks without meaning to.
Yeah, definitely a crucial link there.
So our mission today is to really unpack that relationship between accreditation and CBME. And we're going to zero in on the Canadian experience because they've made some pretty big moves towards outcomes-based accreditation alongside this whole CBME shift.
Mm.
So using the research you sent, we're going to pull out the most important insights. So to make sure we're all starting on the same page, let's just do some quick definitions.
Yeah, good idea.
CBME is all about ensuring those new doctors graduating that they actually have the abilities they need to meet, the health needs of their patients and the broader community.
Exactly. And it's not just about knowing the medical facts. It's about integrating that knowledge with the actual skills, the hands-on stuff, and also those professional attitudes you need to be an effective doctor. Really putting it all together.
Right, it's that whole package.
Exactly. Frank and his colleagues actually summed this up really well back in 2010. It's a great starting point for understanding CBME.
Okay, so within Canada, the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada, they developed this framework called Competence by Design, or CBD. And CBD really emphasizes those outcomes, what doctors can actually do, and it uses time as more of a flexible resource. Like how long it takes you to learn something isn't the main focus. It's about achieving that competency. This was highlighted in some more recent research from 2024, again by Frank and his team. Now, switching gears a bit, accreditation.
Right.
As Frank and his colleagues defined it in 2020, it's basically this formal evaluation. An external being comes in and measures a program against a set of standards to ensure, quality and make sure things are constantly improving.
A kind of quality control check, in a way, making sure everyone's meeting the bar.
Exactly. All right, so with those definitions out of the way, let's dive into this Canadian experience.
So Canada has been a real front runner in this whole movement towards CBME in postgraduate medical education. That's the training doctors get after med school, residency and all that. The College of Family Physicians of Canada, or CFPC, which oversees family medicine training, they put their competency-based CCC curriculum into action. And as we mentioned, the Royal College, which handles specialist training, they've been transitioning to that CBD framework. But here's the thing.
Yeah.
This shift in how we're teaching doctors, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It occurred alongside a major overhaul of how those PGME programs are actually accredited all across Canada.
And that's where the story gets really interesting. They realized they needed a modern accreditation system to support this new approach to education, right?
Absolutely. Couldn't just keep doing things the old way.
So the CFPC teamed up with the Collège de Médecins du Québec, or CMQ, that's the body that regulates physicians in Quebec, and they joined forces with the Royal College. And together, in 2013, they created the Canadian Residency Accreditation Consortium, or CANRAC for short.
A mouthful, but definitely a power team.
Definitely a mouthful. And from 2013 to 2018, CANRAC held these summits, bringing together all these different stakeholders who had a part in Canadian PGME and accreditation, really trying to get everyone on the same page.
A really collaborative approach, getting input from all sides.
Exactly. And all that work led to the launch of their new system on July 1st, 2019, Canadian Excellence in Residency Accreditation, or CANARA.
That's the one we're focusing on.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the research we're looking at describes it as like a package deal, a whole bunch of interconnected changes that completely reshaped the accreditation system.
Pretty big shakeup.
It was. So what was CANARA all about? What were they trying to solve?
Well, first and foremost, they wanted to bring accreditation into the modern era, update the standards, and come up with a fresh way of evaluating programs. Right, make it more relevant to how medicine's actually practiced.
Yeah. They also really emphasized continuous quality improvement, moving beyond just meeting the bare minimum and always striving to be better.
A constant evolution, always pushing for better training and ultimately better care.
Precisely. And they wanted to lighten the load for programs, longer accreditation cycles, 8 years instead of shorter periods, and a new digital platform to streamline things. But a core goal was to design an accreditation system that actually supports the implementation of CBME. So the standards, the policies, the whole process, it needed to be aligned with that core focus on what learners can do.
So Canada was intentionally designing its accreditation system to mirror CBME, to really embed that focus on outcomes. It's not just about time spent in training anymore. That's a key takeaway for anyone interested in education reform.
Definitely. And this alignment between accreditation and CBME, that's huge when we think about how accreditation can actually help CBME take root.
Because if you think about it, the basic educational philosophies that underpin both, those need to be in sync to really drive progress. We can't have one system saying one thing and the other pushing in a different direction.
Exactly. They need to be pulling in the same direction.
Yeah, totally. And accreditation systems, they have a lot of power. They influence how educational institutions operate, how they make decisions. I mean, they hold the keys to accreditation, which is essential for these programs.
It's like the seal of approval.
Exactly.
Well,
So if you're bringing in a new way of doing things like CBME, you need an accreditation system that champions those same principles. Walks the walk and talks the talk.
absolutely. And traditional accreditation models, they often focused on things like structures and processes. How many hours did residents spend training? Did the program have a certain policy in place? It made sense in a time-based system.
Yeah. But with CBME, the focus is on outcomes, right?
Exactly. It's about what the doctor can actually do, their competencies, and that requires ongoing assessment throughout their training. So Canera's design deliberately shifted things to focus on those demonstrable outcomes.
Which is really interesting when you think about what programs have to prove now. It's not enough to just have a policy document. You need to show how that policy is actually being put into practice, how it's impacting those learners.
And that makes a lot of sense. You can have the best policy in the world, but if it's just sitting on a shelf,
Yeah, it's not doing anyone any good.
not doing anyone any good. So this shift to outcomes-based accreditation, it gives programs more freedom to innovate, to try new approaches that align with CBME. They can experiment with different teaching styles, create more individualized learning experiences, and use assessments that directly measure those competencies, the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes.
It allows for greater fidelity of implementation, which means you're more likely to see the real essence of CBME playing out in those programs. And this alignment also strengthens the whole accreditation system. Because an outcomes-based accreditation system, it reflects CBME's goal of producing competent physicians who are ready to make a real difference in people's lives.
Absolutely. It's all about making sure those systems for evaluating training, that they're genuinely aligned with the ultimate goal of improving healthcare. And that brings us to the other side of the coin, quality improvement.
So beyond just making sure programs are meeting the minimum standards, which is the quality assurance part, there's this crucial focus on helping them get better all the time. And that's quality improvement. It's about encouraging programs and the whole medical education system to constantly evaluate themselves and strive for excellence.
And that's especially important when you're implementing something as complex as CBME, right?
Oh, absolutely. Because you're trying something new, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to learn along the way. A quality improvement approach allows for that. It encourages programs to share their successes and their struggles.
Exactly. It's about learning and growing together.
Right. And Canera really made this a priority. While still maintaining that essential quality assurance piece, they really ramped up the focus on continuous improvement. They even created a whole new quality improvement domain within their accreditation standards.
That's a big statement.
It is. They wanted to make it crystal clear that programs needed to demonstrate this commitment to ongoing improvement. It's about building that culture of improvement into the DNA of PGME. And of course, the ultimate aim is to facilitate the adoption of CBME while never compromising patient safety.
Because at the end of the day, that's what matters most.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about the broad philosophy, but now let's zoom in on the nuts and bolts, the accreditation standards themselves. These are the benchmarks for program quality that really shape how programs behave.
And for CBME to flourish, these standards need to be in tune with those competency-based principles.
100%. And this is where it gets a bit tricky, because there's always this balancing act with standards.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you could have really detailed prescriptive standards spell everything out very clearly.
Yeah.
And that can be helpful, especially at the beginning, to make sure everyone's on the same page about what CBME looks like in practice. But
There's a but.
there's always a but. If those standards are too rigid, they can actually stifle innovation. Programs might be discouraged from developing their own creative solutions because they're so worried about ticking every single box.
Right. It's like teaching to the test instead of focusing on what really matters.
Exactly. On the other hand, if your standards are too vague, too focused on those big picture outcomes, well, they might encourage innovation, but they might not give programs enough guidance.
Yeah, they might not know where to start.
Exactly. And that could lead to inconsistencies in how CBME is implemented across the country. So it's a delicate balance between standardization and flexibility, which is something I'm sure resonates with folks working in accreditation and other fields as well.
Absolutely. And this is where Canara tried to find that sweet spot. They structured their standards in this hierarchical way, starting with overarching principles and then getting more and more specific elements, requirements, indicators. But importantly, all those measurable requirements and indicators, those are all evaluated. So programs get really specific feedback on their strengths and areas for improvement.
It's not just a pass or fail. It's about guiding programs towards excellence.
Exactly. So, for example, one of their standards is all about the educational program itself. It states that residents are prepared for independent practice. Seems pretty straightforward, right? But then under that, you have more specific expectations. So one indicator might say that the program's competencies, the things they're teaching and assessing those, have to align with the CanMeds or CanMeds FM framework for that particular specialty. So that's pretty concrete.
Yeah, no wiggle room there.
Not really, but then they also have indicators that allow for more flexibility, like making sure residents' learning experiences are tailored to their individual needs and career goals while still meeting those national standards. So there's that balance.
It's about setting the guardrails, but also giving programs the space to be creative and responsive to their learners' needs. And it's not just the content of the standards that drive CBME. The processes of accreditation matter just as much.
Right. So how are those standards actually assessed? What information is gathered? How are decisions made? Who's involved? And how long does the whole cycle last? These processes, they all need to align with and reward those behaviors and program characteristics that we know support good CBME.
And Canara made some big changes to their processes to do just that. One big one was introducing a grace period. So in that first year after a specialty adopted its CBD framework, programs weren't expected to fully meet every single CBD-specific requirement right away.
That makes sense. It gives them some breathing room.
Right. It's a big change, takes time to adapt. For example, maybe there were some specific requirements about using specialty-specific competencies or implementing certain educational experiences. Those were initially relaxed a bit, just to give programs time to get up to speed.
Smart.
Yeah. They also changed their whole approach to decision-making. They wanted to move away from a system that felt like punishment and create one that encouraged continuous improvement.
More supportive, less stick.
Exactly. So now, if a program identifies an area where they're working to improve, they're not penalized for it during accreditation, as long as they're meeting those minimum standards and showing that they're genuinely committed to making progress.
That's a huge shift in mindset.
It is. It's about acknowledging that improvement is a journey, not a destination. And this is so different from the old way of doing things, where any gap you identified, even if you were already working on it, it could count against you.
So it's more about partnership and progress than about catching programs out.
Exactly. And they also brought in accreditation decisions at the institutional level, with new standards that focused on the institution's role in overseeing and supporting quality improvement across all their PGME programs.
So it's not just about individual programs anymore. It's about the whole institution stepping up.
Exactly. Recognizing that real change needs support from the top down. And one really innovative thing they did was introduce leading practices and innovations, or LPIs.
Tell me more about that.
So the accreditation surveyors, they can actually recognize programs for doing cool, new things, especially things that are showing success with CBD.
So it's like a shout out to the innovators.
Yeah, exactly. And they're creating a whole database of these LPIs so that other programs across Canada can learn from them and maybe even adopt them. It's a great way to spread those good ideas.
So Canara was designed to be this supportive framework for CBME. But like with anything complex, there can be some unintended consequences or limitations, right? Even with all those enabling features, accreditation systems can still create obstacles to CBME, even if they don't mean to.
It's about recognizing that tension between outcomes, which are really important for accountability, and those less tangible but crucial aspects of the learning environment. If we focus too much on what we can easily measure, we might miss those subtle but important factors that contribute to good training.
Like the quality of mentorship, the overall learning environment, the culture of the program. Those things are hard to capture in a spreadsheet.
Exactly. And if we overemphasize those easily quantifiable outcomes in accreditation, we risk overlooking those crucial elements. And that can actually hurt the quality of the program and the learning experience for residents. Because at the end of the day, we want well-rounded doctors, not just doctors who can tick boxes.
Right. It's about the whole picture. And if those underlying elements aren't properly evaluated by the accreditation system, it can actually make it harder for programs to implement CBME effectively.
Because they might not get the support or resources they need in those less visible but essential areas.
So it's about striking that balance, accountability for outcomes, but also attention to those less tangible aspects that contribute to a thriving learning environment.
And another challenge comes from the cyclical nature of accreditation. Programs spend a lot of time and energy getting ready for those accreditation reviews, which usually happen every few years. But medical education is changing so fast, especially with CBME coming into the picture, that this slow cycle can make it hard for standards to stay relevant.
Because what's considered best practice today might be outdated in a couple of years, especially in a field as dynamic as medicine.
Right. And that can lead to what they call anachronistic standards, requirements that no longer make sense in light of these new developments.
Like those time-based requirements we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Those can actually contradict the whole point of CBME, which is about demonstrating competence regardless of how long it takes. So these outdated standards could actually punish programs that are embracing CBME and slow down the whole transition process.
So it really highlights the need for accreditation bodies to be flexible and update their standards regularly to keep pace with those changes in medical education.
Absolutely. Keep things dynamic, keep things relevant. And then, of course, there's the issue of resources.
Right, money and people.
Exactly. Implementing CBME and reforming accreditation at the same time, it takes a lot of resources, both for the accreditation bodies themselves and for the programs undergoing accreditation.
Makes sense. It's a massive undertaking.
It is. Developing and revising those accreditation standards, as we've seen in other countries, that's a big job. And for the programs, all that time and effort spent on accreditation passion, it can take away from their core mission of educating doctors.
So it's important to be mindful of that burden and make sure the accreditation process is as efficient and supportive as possible.
Absolutely. Now, looking ahead, the focus on outcomes in CBME, it opens up some really exciting possibilities for how accreditation might evolve in the future. For example, all that assessment data that CBME programs are generating, that could be a gold mine of information.
Oh, yeah. I see where you're going with this.
We could use that data to really understand what's working and what's not. What kinds of teaching practices are most effective? What's the impact of different rotations? Are quality improvement initiatives actually making a difference?
So instead of just relying on self-reported data or observations during site visits, we could have hard data to back up those accreditation decisions.
Exactly. We could see which faculty development programs actually lead to better feedback from supervisors, or how tweaking a rotation schedule impacts residents' ability to achieve their competencies.
That's a game changer for accreditation, moving from subjective assessments to more objective, data-driven evaluations.
Absolutely. And beyond just those internal metrics, we could even start tracking those long-term outcomes, like how graduates from different programs are actually performing in practice. What could be a better measure of a program's quality than the real-world impact of its graduates?
That's a powerful idea, using real-world data to inform accreditation standards.
Right. It creates this feedback loop where the data collected in practice can directly inform the future direction of medical education. And finally, as we're making these big changes to accreditation, it's crucial to make sure that our processes are actually valid and reliable. We need evidence to back them up.
So not just making changes for change's sake, but being thoughtful and making sure they're actually achieving what we intend.
Exactly. And right now, the research on the validity of accreditation is a little thin. But with these new models being implemented alongside CBME, we have a real opportunity to use all this assessment data and program analytics to strengthen that validity argument.
To show that accreditation is more than just a rubber stamp, it's a meaningful process that's actually making a difference.
Absolutely. So to sum it all up, accreditation systems have a huge role to play in the transition to CBME. From their core educational philosophy and commitment to quality, to the specific standards they set and the processes they use, all of these things present opportunities to really facilitate this shift in medical education.
And Canada's CANARA system is a great example of how a country can intentionally design an accreditation system to support those CBME principles.
But it also highlights those inherent limitations and potential downsides that come with any complex system.
Because there are always trade-offs, right?
Always trade-offs. No perfect system. So as you think about this discussion, consider how these same dynamics might be playing out in your own field. How do accreditation or quality assurance processes, how do they support or hinder innovation. Especially when there are big shifts happening, how can we design oversight systems that truly help us move forward rather than holding us back?
Definitely something to ponder.
Food for thought?
Absolutely.